Hello again, lifelong learners. Dan Alasso here. And today I want to talk a little bit about sort of the form of this great course in the history of the United States, second edition. And I'm going to go through it chapter by chapter on my companion channel, Making History. But for this channel, which is more sort of about the learning process, I want to say some things about the form rather than specifically about the content, I think. Because one of the reasons that I'm looking at this is to think about what other historians have sort of focused on and have thought was important when compiling a kind of a survey text or a course like this. But additionally, I want to sort of think about how they have done this. And of course, this was probably written in the late 90s and published in the early 2000s. And so there are some limitations based on the technology of the time. But in addition, I think there are some choices that the authors made and that the production company made based on the range of things that were available to them at the time. So partly in this, my thinking has been directed by a nice comment that I got from Chris Aldrich on the first post over on Making History. And Chris mentioned that, in his words, students of these courses are often more on the passive side, so they seem to find reasonable scholars who also happen to be good lecturers and storytellers. I think that's true. I think that this is mostly an audio program. So it is a little bit more passive, perhaps, than reading the book. And it does come with this guide, but it's not much of a text. And so I specifically wanted to comment on that. This guide begins with an introductory section that talks about the scope, and specifically in this first introduction talks about the scope of the first 36 lectures, which cover the period from the pre-Columbian Native American era all the way to the Mexican-American War and the Compromise of 1850. And it mentions that some of the things that are going to be covered in this are the themes of exceptionalism, which I mentioned in that other video, socioeconomic mobility, which they sort of equate to opportunity in the marketplace, it seems, expanding enfranchisement and basically democracy, and a confirmation of this idea of the melting pot or inclusion. And then in these early chapters, they say they're going to look specifically at how Americans became what they call an entirely different kind of people, which may end up having some elements of the melting pot in it, may ultimately have some elements of Frederick Jackson Turner's frontier thesis in it. So I'll be interested in seeing. They go on to talk about assimilation and freedom again, and then ultimately they talk very briefly about resources. They do then go on to mention different patterns of settlement in New England, the Chesapeake, and the Middle Colonies, which will be interesting to look at. One of the things that I would point out, as I typically do, is that they're apparently going to entirely ignore British Canada once the English take over Canada in 1763, and the Caribbean, which the British have a much, much longer experience with, as they're in the Caribbean as early as they're in continental North America. And a lot of the influences, especially on the South, come from the Caribbean. So I hope they say something about that. They go on to talk about the Enlightenment, the Industrial Revolution, the Republican system, and the question of public virtue. And so these are their overview bullet points, really, of the themes that they're going to address. And then they begin this very, very brief chapter. It's only 3 pages long, that corresponds with the first half hour or so of the audio that I've already reviewed. And as the audio was, this chapter is titled Living Bravely. And they very, very briefly give kind of abstracts of the main points that I've already discussed in that other video. The ancientness of Native Americans in the Americas, Kennewick Man, and how perhaps at the time they thought he was going to upset the apple cart of that story. And then they move on to Europe, the fall of the Roman Empire, the Crusades, these things that I have mentioned before, the Black Death, and what they call the newly reunited Spanish, who begin to think about acting outside their borders the way they have been acting inside their borders. And I think that if they don't talk about the Reconquista, this will be a missed opportunity, because I think a lot of what informs Spanish colonialism in the New World is based on their centuries-long experience of trying to take the Iberian Peninsula back from the Muslims. Now, there's a box on this page that says some of this was sheer heartless slaughter and exploitation by the Spaniards who enslaved conquered Indians and put them to work to support Spanish enrichment. And that isn't untrue, but again, it sort of ignores the issue of the Columbian Exchange and the diseases that killed 90 to 95% of all Native Americans. And so putting that bold in a box like that is a little bit problematic for me and kind of seems to reinforce what became known as the Black Legend, which was kind of a propaganda campaign on the part of the English and the Dutch, the Protestants, against the Catholic Spanish that described them as excessively barbarous, and in doing so sort of implied that the Dutch and the English and the Protestants were not certainly going to behave that way in the New World, which of course didn't turn out to be accurate. And then this brief introduction goes on to talk about the idea that Columbus's discovery of America was a great disappointment because he didn't make it all the way to Asia, which I think is inaccurate. And so I question their emphasis of that. And then, as I mentioned in the other video, they also talk about this idea that people like Cortez and Pizarro were individual freebooters, in their words, and acted with what they call minimal state oversight. And so it'll be interesting to me to see what it is that they hope to gain by that description. And a clue to that might be that in the final paragraph, they talk about political or exploitative arrangements unthinkable to European society. And while I would agree that the Atlantic slave trade was innovative in its barbarism, it wasn't an entirely new thing. It wasn't an entire break from the past, because before Columbus discovered America in the Caribbean, and the Spanish started trying to enslave the native peoples, and then when the natives died off, started to bring in Africans, the Spanish and the Portuguese had already been using enslaved Africans in sugar plantations in places like the Azores and the Canary Islands and Sao Tome and Porto Santo along the coast of Africa. So there's more continuity in this tradition than there is kind of abrupt change and innovation on the part of the people who came to North America. Now, Chris had mentioned in his comment that there are also some interesting recommended readings or bibliographic suggestions in these very brief. And in this case, there are 3 items of suggested reading. And the first of those is William Cronin's book, Changes in the Land, which is a great book. I have it on my shelves. And they suggest that students read chapter 2. And then in addition, they suggest Samuel Eliot Morison's The European Discovery of America, which was published in 1971, which I don't have a copy of on my shelves, but it's a good book. And then finally, Ronald Wright's book, Stolen Continents, which I think was originally published in 2005. And the edition that is pictured here is an international edition from the Penguin Modern Classics that came out in 2015. So this is also considered a classic book. Additionally, I might suggest, and I typically do require in my courses, that students read a passage from Crosby's The Columbian Exchange, which is subtitled Biological and Cultural Consequences of 1492, and even maybe something new, like Ned Blackhawk's The Rediscovery of America, which came out just recently, and gives kind of a native perspective on American history. And so I'll be dipping into that from time to time as I develop my course. So to conclude with my thoughts about the form of this, I think that the audio presentations are just fine. The quality of the audio is good. They break them into little tracks that are 6 to 8 minutes long. And I've often considered whether or not to take kind of major subject points and break them into short moments like that. And right now I'm kind of leaning in favor of that process. So you'll probably see something that emulates that in my presentations. Looking at the booklet that comes along with it, I don't think that this initial chapter, 3 pages about what has been talked about on the other thing, is really that interesting or useful or necessary. Alternatives to that, now that we're publishing things digitally, might be to provide the entire text of the lecture in a form that a student could read and annotate, and then maybe more detailed and extensive supplementary readings or source readings, and especially primary sources, which of course is something that I'm going to focus on in mine. So that's how I'm responding to the form of this, and also the form of other textbooks and whatnot that I've encountered in the past in developing my own. I hope you found that a little bit interesting. Thanks very much for watching. I'll see you again very soon.